and the presentation. Okay, here we are. So, today, for your happiness, I think that the lecture is going to be a little bit shorter than usual, not 4 hours. And hello. Hi. It's morning. I just began right now, so good morning. So I was telling that the lecture today, I think it's going to be a little bit shorter than usual. So we have time for a debate at the end to have comments or whatever, also about other lectures, and or else we can stop before. I would like to know if you received the email with the seminar. Okay, so next Monday, remember that it's going to be in the afternoon. I think that at 5:30, 5:45 we have to stop because one of the guests is going to take a flight, and I also have another meeting. Anyway, so we have to begin a little bit in time, at 2:15. And it's going to be organized a little bit like the last seminar, the two interventions. It's your computer, okay, no problem. The two interventions by the guests and then the debate will be shared by Maria Mainardi and me as well, of course. So, in order to prepare ourselves for the next meeting, I thought that today we could dedicate our last lecture of the course to this question of representation, because we said last time, remember if you were online following last lecture, we said at the end, some of you, I guess it was the other guy from Colombia, introduced the idea of digital representation, of digital imageries. And we were talking about photography and the role that photography has played, say, in the place of painting in the last decades, in interpreting our ideas, our sensibilities, our imageries, our projections about the landscape. Okay, the role of photography in Italy. We followed this path, and we arrived to Ghirri, Olivo Barbieri, this generation of photographers who brought a change into our way of looking at things, looking at our world, looking at architecture as well, the relation between architecture and its environment. Today, I would like to propose you a reflection based actually quite almost uniquely, but not uniquely, on this issue of the magazine Lotus International that we have worked in 2017. It's called exactly as this lecture, Manufactured Out of Landscape. And it is, with Lotus magazine, we always have dealt with this question of imageries. Say we deal with the architecture of the project, the world of the project in general, so linked also to other disciplines sometimes and to imagery, so art and photography. There are two issues of Lotus dedicated to photography. One is an old one. I don't remember exactly the year, but I put in the bibliography in the last lecture, and this one that is the more recent one, because we were interested in trying to explore a little bit more this world of landscape photographers in order to understand, because in a way we thought that these photographers were trying and sometimes anticipating, trying to interpret and sometimes anticipating, as Ghirri did, the visions, the imageries about our contemporary approach to landscape and environment in general. So we were interested in exploring a little bit their work, trying to go a little bit in depth in their work, in their interest, in the reasons why they chose certain subjects, the reason why they chose a certain way to express the subjects. And we chose some interesting photographers that dealt with built environment and landscape in general. So not only built environment, the environment and the landscape in general. So of course, there are photographers who will only deal with portraits, and that was not our interest. And we chose some of them that for us were more interesting. There are 8. Actually, in this lecture, there are more references and more photographers, but many of the photographs that I will show you today that I organized in subjects, in themes, are taken by the work of these photographers. Maybe you never heard about these guys or these girls, I don't know, maybe yes. Some of them are very famous as artists. Some, for example, Gursky, maybe you know Gursky, Andreas Gursky is a German photographer. I'm interested, let's say, in it may seem a little bit out of the themes of our classrooms and of our course, but I don't think so, because I think that dipping ourselves in the imageries, in more recent imageries about landscape, can help us to shape our visions, to shape our way also to design, as we always said from the beginning, from the start of this course. So I really want you to merge into these more recent imageries and how to say, measure your view, your capacity of looking, your gaze, thanks to this baggage, so this repertoire of photographers. That is interesting also because they are actually facing very important and recent themes, issues. So, Manufactured Art and Landscape is the title of this issue, the title of the lectures, because their category that seems to be dominant in this setting, in this group of works, is the alteration, is this category of alteration. We, for example, when we dealt with Ghirri last time, we noticed that Ghirri changes the way of looking at things, but doesn't want to change things at all, and doesn't want to, let's say, he's focusing on the, say, observation of a transformation of things themselves, but never abandoning the data, the things, the world as it appears, the visibility of the things that are the existent. We talked a lot about the existent, giving value to the existence. Remember the last time we talked about giving value to what exists and giving it a sort of aesthetical legitimation, although maybe it was not yet part of a categorized aesthetical, let's say, aesthetical categories that were already consolidated, because aesthetical categories are always changing. Our value, the value that we attribute to them, is always changing. In this case, there is a very subtle, but not so subtle difference in the view of these more recent artists and photographers and interpreters of reality. That is this category of alteration. Alteration is not only in things, but also in the way we photograph and we catch things. I'm going to explain a little better. Alteration is a little bit a category of the world itself. Now that we talked a lot about it, we entered this new era, let's say, this new Anthropocene, let's say, geological era, according to some definition, according to the approved, let's say, official definition. We entered actually this new geological era in which everything is manufactured, and so man has given its imprint and its left its footprint all over nature. There are not anymore places, or there are very few places in the world that are not affected by our presence, and actually also the places that are not directly affected by our presence are in any case affected by us. And so this is the first level. You can consider this one, this is the first level of alteration. The photography always dealt for a long time. Remember when we talked about the North American tradition of landscape, we talked about Timothy O'Sullivan, Compton Watkins, all this generation of photographers who anticipated this idea of the wilderness, looking for uncontaminated, unspoiled nature, wherever it was, the myth of the American landscape based on the idea of the wilderness. Now, the idea of the wilderness is not anymore, doesn't make any sense if not pushed in a very subtle, ambiguous direction that is depicting wilderness, looking for wilderness with a nostalgic, sometimes tone, where there is not anymore. There is no wilderness anymore. There is no wilderness. We don't have where to find it. So, and also wilderness is, say, we will see in some photos, it's always menaced, threatened by something that is actually changing its very nature. So first level of alteration is in the world, in the ground itself. The second level of alteration that can have many manifestations, many expressions, is in representation itself. So photographers are really taking the burden of painting. Remember, painting always transfigurated reality. And also photography is taking this burden in trying to create images that are transfigurating reality in directions that maybe we can also conceive with our minds, but they're not actually in the world, because we use digital methods in photography. We are fascinated by, I don't know, effects that are blurring, distorting, altering in many ways what we see. And sometimes this distortion, this alteration brings with it a deep sense, something that is bringing a deeper sense to the images that these photographers are producing. So we were, I don't want to anticipate so much, we're going to go into their works and trying to comment. And if you want also to notice something, we want to comment together, of course we can also dialogue a lot. So that's only to explain the reason of the title, Manufactured Altered Landscape. This category is dominant. The category of something that is not anymore in its primeval state, because it's always manufactured, the world is manufactured, and the alteration, many levels of alteration, several levels of alteration. So this is the cover of Lotus I already showed you. And this is more or less the sentence that we find here as a sort of synthesis of abstract of this issue that I want to read in order to introduce some topics that we want to tackle today. So that disquieting questions emerges of whether a transformation of the very being of our planet is taking place as a result of human intervention. Okay, so we already commented this. We have this disquieting question. The world is not anymore, let's say, something that that is transforming itself. Of course, it is beyond our control, but our control is always more and more important. And sometimes our control is bringing a loss of control. We are talking about the emergency for the weather, for the climate change. This is due a lot to our impact in the world. And so what does it mean? That our control and our over-control over the world is also bringing with it a loss of control, a losing of control. You know, over-control sometimes brings a little bit of losing of control. So it's an ambiguity. We see a succession of images of alterations that have led to a sort of concealment of nature. Concealment means nascondimento, something, hiding of nature, with other images in which we glimpse its reappearance. Sometimes nature is reappearing over, say, beyond the soil, almost as if it were an object from another time, a deep time. So we are looking for this relation that is actually always changing, always threatened. Our relation with nature is at the center of our interest, as well as it is always more difficult. As Jean-Christophe Bailly puts it, Jean-Christophe Bailly, I already quoted it last time, he's a philosopher, it's more, maybe a philosopher, he also deals a lot with landscape. He's a French scholar, also teaching at the Versailles School of Landscape, So he says in one of the essays of this issue, what we feel passing through the landscapes that surround us is that the discrepancy between what we used to consider their legitimate representation and what they are actually becoming has grown, making room for an expectation of new images. Images that would be not so much realistic as simply in keeping with the fundamental tone of the age. The way that Jean-Christophe Bailly expresses himself is quite difficult because he's a philosopher, so he uses this way of talking. But what he wants to say in shorter words is that we don't recognize anymore what we see. Remember when Neri in the 80s said, we lost the capacity to see. We see too many things and we don't have anymore the capacity to see. So we are going through a similar epoch, a similar moment, we can say. Of course, these are categories that are, say, useful for explaining or for didactic reason. It's not, we always are in search of new categories, but there are epochs, moments in which there is a sort of shortage of new concepts of representation. Imagine when philosophers imagine and explore and creating new concepts, new words. A lot of philosophers imagine new words in order to create the concepts that are used to interpret reality. Before the metropolis existed, the term metropolis didn't exist. Before the megalopolis existed, we didn't have the need to use the term megalopolis because we didn't have the phenomenon. So reality changes and we need always more new concepts to explain it. And the same thing is with images. Okay, the same is with imageries. And so we don't recognize anymore what we have around, says Bailly. There is a discrepancy between our categories, the categories we own from the past, and the things that we see, because there have been transformations that have been more faster than the industrial revolution ones. We are really in the middle of a really fast change in transformation of all the organizational setting of the landscape, all the industrial, for example, all the built heritage of the industrial revolution has been going in the last decades through a reconversion, through an abandonment and then a reconversion. Imagine what it entails in terms of the changing of what we have around. And so we have an expectation of new images that can be in keeping with the fundamental tone of the age. So I think that it is a good manifesto for the lecture, because I would like to sustain that this burden is the one that the photographers take on themselves. The attempt to find these images or to create these images that are in keeping with the tone of the age. This is their attempt. We can agree with them or not, but they're trying to do this. And I just opened with two images. This is an image by Sonia Brass that is taken from a series that is, I put the title more after, because I put after also this photo that is from the point of this solution. Sonia Bras, I will explain you later. Sorry for doing this. Is a photographer who works a lot with alteration because she works with models made in the studio. So this is not an actual city seen from the airplane as it would seem. It is a model created in the studio, and the power of this image that has been also included in an exhibition that was dedicated to the uncanny. We will see this category of the uncanny, is to show this menace that is actually threatening us, threatening our built environment, like this fire that is advancing in the horizon, and that we can imagine it will devastate completely the city we see in the photo. And so there is this doubt, this ambiguity. If how long does our civilization, our built environment could still be living? How long can we still be able to live on the planet? How, etc. So the aim of this lecture, in a way, is to explore this vitality and the new aesthetic content of these reflections on polluted soil, of losing of control, of manufactured altered landscape, and to explore the destructive aesthetic potential of this alteration. So exactly as Sonia Bras do in this work. Now you see this potential destruction that is menacing on the civilization. And on the other side, there is the question that is very important of the thematization of the gaze. Remember, we talked about also the Impressionists. They were the ones who, in a way, they began to thematize the gaze in the second half of the 19th century. And these photographers are actually working a lot on this thematization of the gaze. Also, Ghirri worked with thematization of the gaze. Remember when he photographed the telescope, he photographed the window, he photographed the structure that framed a portion of the beach, of the sand, in order to create a sort of powerful metaphor of photography on how you look at the gaze, of how you look at the world. And also, this photo is a strong manifest of this attitude, because this is Thomas Truss, an important German photographer, who is, you see that all these, the most of these photos are of the last 2 decades, are in 2000 and something. There are only a few of them in the lecture that I included that are a little bit earlier. Anyway, Thomas Truss is here talking about this idea of the filter, again, as much as the Impressionist or Caillebotte, remember, to use the balcony and sometimes the fence dividing the person to some filter, some physical filter that talked about the fact that sometimes the protagonist of the painting was looking at something, and the viewer, and there was this system of filters, of concatenated filters. The viewer, the protagonist of the painting, the main character taken from the back, then the balcony, the view of the street, etc. In this case, we have the filter that is the glass of the aquarium. And the life of the fishes in this marine scene is a sort of metaphor of human life. So we have on one side the observers, children and their parents that are observing what is happening behind the glass, and this scene in which fishes and other marine creatures, let's say, are making their lives without even maybe feeling of being observed. So we have this system of filters, and in a way, a manifesto on the condition of men in the world. So I think this image is very powerful in this sense. So in a way, these two are the two manifestos of this visual manifesto of this lecture. Now, as I told you, I divided the lecture in categories. Categories that are, themes, topics that I want to focus on a little bit, according to which I divided the images chosen. The first one is called encrustations, and it deals on a certain interpretation of the surface of the Earth as a system, a very complex articulated system made of organic and inorganic layers and elements. The surface of the Earth is, we saw it a little bit when we talked about landscape urbanism. It is a category very much used by landscape urbanists, thinkers, James Corner, etc. This idea of the surface as a system, a complex system that is made of different fluxes, different flows, different infrastructures, different layers of interaction in which organic and inorganic things interact with each other. And that's at the center of the view of these photographers. This idea of the surface of the Earth as this complex system, this encrustation of different organic and inorganic things. And one of the most important, I guess, one of the photographers who interpreted this with most power is Andreas Gursky, that I was mentioning before. Andreas Gursky is one of the most famous living products, we can say, of the Düsseldorf School of Photography. Remember the Beckers? We talked last time about the Beckers, these two German couple who cataloged industrial buildings according to their shapes, typological cataloging of industrial buildings. And they were the founders of the Düsseldorf School of Photography, and this Düsseldorf School had produced a lot of the most important photographers active today, among which Andreas Gursky, who, by the way, is also one of the most paid photographers in the world. There are some works by Andreas Gursky that can really that are valued on the art market as much as the more renowned artists. So photography is now, we can also say, it is a little bit out of our interest, but we also maybe have to understand that nowadays we are in a moment in which photography is exactly on the same level as art, other art productions, art expressions, in terms also of value, but also the importance attributed to it. This has been a long effort. It's been a long road, because of course photography has been for a long time considered a second, let's say, secondary art expression. Anyway, Andreas Gursky shows us portion of surfaces, now we will see the photos, that look like encrustations generated by biological processes, both natural and artificial. Zones where organisms and inorganic material interact with one another, living systems with their own structure and cycles of production. This all-embracing vision of an ecological character, so the world, the surface of the Earth, is an ecological entity, and is seen as an ecological entity made of the interaction of all these flows, leaves in suspense the troubling question of the role of human intervention in the very transformations of the surface of our planet, halfway between bucolic dream and industrial nightmare. So there is always, I am going to insist a little bit on this today, there is always this suspension of it's a sort of suspension of disbelief, a suspension of the judgment. There is a very powerful aesthetical fascination with things that are potentially very threatening. So there is a suspension between these two things. It's going to be, let's say, this is fascinating, but it's a bucolic dream, it's a nostalgic stuff, or it's an industrial nightmare. We don't actually grasp it. The potentiality, the ambiguity, and the power of these images stays exactly in this unsolved question, in the ambiguous nature of their choices. So, for example, I show you, this is the really, sorry, sometimes I need to help myself with the notes, and I don't have the relatore modality, the speaker modality, because then you also always see it. There is this stockyard. It's a place where the animals are raised and then killed and etc. Is the stockyard. We're in Greeley, and we actually, apparently, this image is created exactly with an existing stuff. So we can imagine that this image is true, it's taken from reality. But there is something that is a little bit strange, weird. It gives us a weird impression. Do you think it is? Is it possible that a stockyard is so big? What do you think about this image? Do you think it's exactly like that, or that there's an intensification, and how did Gursky achieve this intensification? Because you actually don't grasp it from the beginning. It's an alteration that you can't grasp if you don't know, but you can feel that there is something strange. I don't hear because I'm a little bit too regular. Yeah.
Like a city.
Like a city. It seems to be exactly. It seems to be a city because it is a metaphor, and everything for Gursky. It is a metaphor of this surface of the earth that is all organized. But, and it's all too regular for being a stockyard. But not only, because sometimes, say, you imagine that around this there would be something else, there would be something called, I don't know, some scattered elements. Reality is never so perfect. So what Gursky does is this intensification. So he cancel, he delete from the scene he wants to take what is not part of the story, what it doesn't, with what is not helping his narration. It's like all the useless elements, he deletes them digitally from the image, and it's not the only thing. He multiplies the images several times. So this stock, say, the image is not actually depicting a thing like this. He multiply the stockyard several times in order to achieve this intensification, this multiplication, this augmented reality. It is not reality as it appears. It is an augmented reality. Something that talks about what Gursky, how Gursky interprets reality, and not exactly a description, oriented description of reality, as much as photography has been used to do, because the instruments the photographers have got of alteration, of manipulation of the images are so strong that you can obtain whatever image you like, starting from a data of reality, and then manipulating these data the way you want in order to achieve the image that you want to achieve. So that's interesting because, as I told you, there is this second level of manipulation, of alteration, that is not only in reality, but it is in the image. And as you said, it's interesting that you compared this one to a city, because actually Gursky is playing on mass society with this multiplication of the cows. Of course, the cows can be us. So, of course, mass society is the center of this photo, and consumption, no. Mass society and its environment. Hello. So, okay, in other photos, it does the more or less similar thing. Oh, by the way. Okay, like this. This is another Gursky photo. In this one, you can see that there is this attempt, many times, because there is a very famous photo, I didn't put it, of the pyramids in Egypt, which doesn't photograph the pyramid like this. The pyramid like this, as we are, let's say, everybody seems to see it. No, this photography, this is the picture, or the frame of the picture, and the pyramid is this mass of stones, one over the other. So, in this case, this augmented reality that we have with the Stockyard in Greenway that we saw before is achieved through the reality itself, because you focus on you have a close-up of the pyramid in which you only see the single elements composing the pyramid and not anymore the synthetic shape of the pyramid. So you're not interested in seeing the synthetic shape, also because the synthetic shape of the pyramid is an icon that we all know, and it doesn't maybe have so much to say, or something new to say to us. While looking and investigating its matter with its imperfection, the erosion of the stones from a close-up view changes completely the position, changes completely the point of view. And it is a little bit what happens in this one, in which we have this mountain with the snow and the vegetation coming out of the snow, which we have the surface that is more or less uniform surface, in which we have this abstraction, but also this investigation on the matter of the things themselves and not on their global shape. So, and this is a little bit this. We will see that in the next category is this topographic view. We will talk a little bit on this topographic view. That is another category that is important for these photographers, together with the encrustations. In this other photo of Andreas Gursky, LMA, of course, we have solar panels. And of course, again, it's not true. So it's a product of an intensification of a multiplication, in which we have this play, this ambiguity again between something natural, say natural shape of the hills, this landscape. It is apparently very regular landscape of the hills, like the window screenplay, fondo anyway. While it is made of two surfaces, there is a surface beneath that is the grass, actually the normal one that we're used to, that we would expect, and another surface superposing on it that is the solar panel. So we have this ambiguity between what is natural, what is not, and what is, say, beautiful and what is not, what is encountering our static categories, our consolidated static categories, but in a subtly different way. So Gursky is always playing with these categories. This is Sonia Brass again, the one of the fire. And again, this is the product of a model constructed in the atelier and then photographed. She works like that. She imagines the photograph, the image she wants to create. Then she creates the model. And after she took the photograph, it's always an analogic photograph, never digital, always analog. So she mixed this. She plays with what is fake and what is not, because the analogical mean wants to say, convey some imperfection of reality, but something that is actually not real, but it is created on purpose in the atelier, and then she destroys the model. So what is left, it's an artistic practice actually, quite more than, it's a photographer, but working with artistic practices. And in this case, again, we have this continuous surface. Of course, we can't see the end, as a little bit like in the fire one. And we have, again, this idea of an ecosystem in which we can't understand if it is a natural formation or a city or a destroyed city or something abandoned or something ancient or something. We really don't understand it, but there is something menacing in the photo, because actually, I don't see what you see in that, but I see maybe the remains of a settlement, of a city, not exactly a city, but something, the ruins, maybe the ruins of a city. I have this impression that's in the photo that is depicting the ruins of an existing city, but also a city that, say, something that we don't know, because it's similar to also, there are holes and patios, but so it's similar to some human settlements, but also to some, I don't know, what animals sometimes do, digging their homes in the ground. So we don't distinguish very well if it is a natural formation or an incrustation, or it is the remains of a city. And that's what she wants to say. As Gursky, she's also saying that the city itself is an incrustation on the surface of the earth. It is part of it. It's not something superposed. So it's an interrelation of different systems. As any ecosystem, it's always an interrelation between different organisms that can be, as I said, natural or not, or organic or not. This is a very beautiful triptych that is an homage to Pierpaolo Pasolini, because maybe you know some movies by Pierpaolo Pasolini, but he used to shot several of his famous scenes and movies in Matera, in Basilicata. These are the Sassi of Matera. I don't know if you ever visited. You've been there? Really? Yeah. With some professor? Wow, with who? Oh, okay. And so you're working on the Sassi for the project? No. The science you also visited the Sassi. And you visited La Martella? No? La Martella is a very interesting neighborhood. It is La Martella. I wanted to, do you remember Rattalino, when Elisabetta Rattalino talked about the countryside, she also mentioned La Martella, because it was this neighborhood that has been constructed, that has been designed and realized in the Second World War period, exactly after the Second World War, by Ludovico Quaroni and other Italian architects, in order to move the people from the Sassi into this new settlement in the countryside outside Matera. And it's a very famous, example of how Italian progressist architects and intellectuals have tried together, for example, with Olivetti. You know that it was called The Shape of Italy, and Togliatti was intervening, a lot of intellectuals were intervening in the story. And these architects and intellectuals tried to create, and it was actually a little bit of a failure, to create a settlement, a modern settlement that was evoking the ties of community ties present in the Sassi. So the La Martella is important because its articulation, its master plan is actually all played in order to try to recreate from scratch in another place, in modern terms, the community ties that were present in the in the living community of the Sassi. So it's sort of ancestral way of living all together, living in community, of living in groups, in a sort of, I don't know, a mutual help of family groups, a little bit like happens in favelas or in barriadas. I think a little bit this thing is happening there. Anyway, just to, because you were there, maybe you will visit La Martella, but you didn't. You weren't there. Okay. Anyway, next time you can go. Maybe next year we'll be able to organize a trip. This year I wasn't able to organize it because of many other stuff, but anyway. And next year, if COVID allows us and my commitments, I will try to organize a trip. Anyway, and this photo is interesting because actually it is I did a photographer that we worked together with for Lotus many times. She went to Matera and stayed there many days, several days, weeks, I guess, and then showed one photo. Say, of course, maybe to achieve this, but she went, but she just found at the end the way she wanted to portray Matera, and it was this triptych, this homage to Pasolini, that can be, in my opinion, well described by these words, through these words by Gilles Clément, because Gilles Clément also worked with Edith. They did together a book that is called Euroland, with the photograph by Edith Hu and text by Gilles Clément. And he said, the spread of coral heads accumulates cracks in the reef through which the architecture advances, like a city in expansion. A nameless band borders the gigantic city, a city that has become, little by little, a multiform entity, an agglomeration. This is not referring to this triptych of Matera, but I guess that is interesting to put them in relation, because what Edith wanted to do is exactly to convey, in my opinion, this idea of the city as a stratification of different systems in which you can't really anymore distinguish what is the organic natural strata and the constructed one, the human one. You know how here we have rock, only rock with vegetation. It seems to be only rock. If you really look at this, it is filled with holes and cavities and things that are dig actually by man. Then over it there is this sort of passage, as it was a section of the city. It is a sort of world of passage between the stratification of the rocks and the city itself, the first layers of the city that are merging completely with the rock. They are not independent. They are a unique system together with the rock. And the Sassi are actually carved in the rocks. And then the new city, say the modern, say city to simplify, is laying over the strata, but having roots in a way. Of course, we can distinguish different layers because, of course, here we see a sort of line of demarcation in which there is a rupture of the continuity. There is a different model of settlement, of construction, etc. But it is saying that we can interpret also the actual city in the same exact way because we see it merged with all the other layers. And this is, in my opinion, a powerful representation of this idea of the encrustation of the city, as a part of the surface of the earth. That this encrustation that is not anymore distinguishable, so which is an ecosystem altogether, which constitutes an ecosystem altogether. On these ones, I'm going to go fast just to show you the photo because we commented on this topic. So just another photo by Gursky. It's Tokyo. You see here this blurring. Again, Gursky is always portraying also when it seems to be actually a view taken from reality and not altered. Of course, also in this case, we have an alteration. Also in this case, we have a construction, a very cerebral, a very intellectual construction of the image. Of course, it is not, let's say, Gursky didn't go to the top of a skyscraper and took this colorless photograph and it's okay. He worked on this in the studio digitally on the computer and created this view in which we have a surface, indistinguishable surface of small houses, and then this chaotic, let's say, surface of, let's say, agglomeration of Tokyo. Thomas Struth, in a different way, this is Ulsan. So again, I'm not commenting too much, just showing. Or the Cerro Morsolari in Lima. Again, we have this merging of the barriada with the mountain, with the natural, with the ground. Actually, it is part of the ground, and the colors are also dealt in a way that this settlement appears to be part of the ground. And then another German guy who is also it's not part of the Düsseldorf school. He has a very different story. He was very influenced by the British subculture, countercultural movement, youth counterculture movement. So he was for a long time actually dealing with the portraits of his friends of homosexual environment, milieu in London, for example, or in Berlin. So it dealt with many different topics. And in this case, in this series of photographs of cities taken from the tops, it's interesting because he wants to convey it doesn't want to portray a single place. For example, he titles his photos of the city not according to the city, but according to the color of the filter that he uses to create images. For example, this one is called green, this one is called yellow. We don't know, either we don't recognize the cities, but we don't know actually which cities these are. We're not actually interested to know this, because he says here that he wants to portray the surface of the social fabric. Let's say he looks at cities and agricultural landscapes as systems that have been developed out of innumerable human activities. And for this reason, he explains that he titles his pictures according to their dominant color, not the name of the location, because they are not intended to be a representation of specific places, but representation of these systems. So we pass to another category. We on side for one moment in encrustations, and I would like to introduce this idea of the topographic view. I already mentioned before with Gursky, but and the chaos pattern is a good example of this. My drawing is very bad, but maybe you can look for it in the internet. And you find it? Okay. Yeah. You have to look at it. I think it's called Cheops or something like that. I forgot to put it. Anyway, this what do I mean with the topographic view? The topographic view, I read it, and it's self-explanatory, and then we talk about it. A new topographic dimension in landscape photography tends to eliminate such common marks of orientation as references of scale, the horizon, and people, capturing just a small portion of ground that fills the entire field of the camera with a vision of nature from up close that looks deeper than the human eye can. The loss of indications of scale pushes the edge of the framing beyond the picture, infusing the landscape with a sense of grace and disorientation at one and the same time. So, in one word, we can say elimination, the erosion of the borders, of the frames. Topographic view means that you don't have anymore the reference of scale. You don't have anymore the pyramid. We have with this horizon, the desert, and the frame of the picture like that. We don't have anymore this situation. We lose the references of scale. We see only a close-up. This close-up can be this, or can be this, a piece of the earth. And we lose the scale because we don't actually sometimes distinguish what we are looking is something, I don't know, from an airplane or from, I don't know, the vision of the insect of the ground or something at the micro scale. So there's something similar to remember when we talked about Gregotti, topographic landscape, and we looked at the photos that he used to illustrate the issue of Edilizia Moderna. And there were some images that were playing a little bit on this idea of losing of the scale. Sometimes they also there see this being figurable. They were sometimes seen as from the space, or sometimes in from the microscope. Sometimes you lost this idea. Anyway, here we have it in a different way. And this is a photo that explains a little bit this thing. This is Put Berger, Belgian. No, sorry, olandese, Netherlands, come si dice olandese? From Holland. A photographer from the Netherlands who used to work a lot with this idea of the topographic gaze, and this is a photo of him photographing. So you see that he's still looking at apparently completely not interesting portion of sort of marshy place. This is of course I don't know exactly where he is. Anyway, he's looking at this wet ground in order to catch the details of this view, losing completely the borders, the corners, the reference, the rise of the people. So he wants to go beyond the scope of documentary photography, creating abstract images of the landscape and prompting the viewer to look below the surface, attracted by details, vortices, and swirls that compose unprecedented natural scenes of surprising beauty. Okay, this is a sentence from that dish. So this is a more or less product of this way of looking landscape. So it's a completely different view from, if you compare it to the great tradition of landscape painting, for example, imagine in which, okay, you have this idea of what is landscape. For Berger wanted to push a little bit, to question a little bit this consolidated idea that is made of an horizon, and wants to go a little bit into a vertical thing, exploration of things instead of horizontal. So this photography is more dealing with this vertical observation. That is a sort of digging, sort of like an investigation of a very small and apparently insignificant portion of reality, in which he detects some beauty, some aesthetic content. And, for example, in these cases, in which there is this swirl of water that you don't know beneath this fungi or anyway, vegetation, wet vegetation, you can't even very well distinguish the scale. You can imagine, but maybe you lose a little bit because it can be tricky in terms of understanding its scale. Sometimes he also blurs these images. He doesn't. I don't think he uses digital means to blur the images, but actually analogical means. But it's interesting because these images appear to be, they have a contact with the reference, because you can imagine what they are, but they also move toward a more abstract dimension. So they are in the middle between something very figurative, something that is still very much linked to the reference, to the object, subject that they're describing, but at the same time they are overcoming a little bit this, toward a more abstract representation, kind of representation. And here, this project that is called Ruigord, in which he made several photographs of this land, this piece of land, this plot of land was prepared for development, so for hosting and housing development, using this sand mixed with the seeds of wildflowers that was meant to stabilize the soil that was then meant to in which the development should have been raised. So the beauty of this view, this very close-up view of the stabilized soil, is a very banal soil in which in a few moments housing estates will be appearing. But in this moment there is this beauty, this delicate beauty given by this, the use of these wildflowers to stabilize the soil, and the view, the close-up view of these flowers with this sand soil gives us an idea of, again, a little bit what happened with Girri, with the views of the marginal sides of the highway in the Po Valley, and the attribution of an aesthetic power, of aesthetic value to something that we used to consider completely marginal, not worthy of attention, maybe, I don't know, yeah, also insignificant. And so there is this attempt. Also here it's a similar thing. These are, say, natural incrustation. I think that this is especially algae in the marine, rocky formation, so organic and inorganic material merging one with each other. And a similar thing can be seen also, for example, in other photographers. This is Mizrak. We will see Mizrak in the other categories a little bit better. These are, of course, shell casings near the Gulf of Mexico in Texas. Mizrak is an American photographer, one of the most important living American photographers, and he created this epic work that is called Desert Cantos, beginning at the end of the 70s and beginning of the 80s, and always enriching itself with new parts of this work. Anyway, he worked a lot in the desert, so in the Californian desert or in the Gulf of Mexico. Anyway, in the American deserts, and in this case we have this composition made of the remains by man of this human violence, the shell casings left there as debris on the land. Okay, I go fast a little bit on this. This is another two other schools. Rupil of the Beckers, Simone Niebeck she's a German photographer, and again, also here there is this idea that you can't grasp the whole picture, but you can only imagine how the image continues beyond. This is very natural to photography. So it is an impressionism in which the painting, let's say, absorbed a little bit this idea of photography, in which you couldn't see the end of the scene, which you had only a portion of the scene. But we have this also here a little bit like Berger, this idea of concentrating on the small, apparently insignificant portion of reality with all its details, the details of the growing of the vegetation, but also the how to say, sometimes it's defect, it's the erosion, it's imperfections. And again, a very banal subject that is taken as a monumental subject in her case. She's used to portray this so-called Grabeland. In German, the Grabeland, in Germany, the Grabeland is a plot of land. It's called Grabeland. It is a plot of land that is affittato. It is given in to rented, yeah, maybe rented can be on an annual base to be cultivated by the inhabitants. So there are abandoned plots that are passing from one owner to the other, not owner but user to the other, in order to create like small vegetable gardens, orchards, etc. And so they are sort of transitory lands that are always changing, that have not a specific identity, that are always transformed. And she was very interested in investigating this pieces of land and focusing a lot with this cataloging attitude that is very close to the Becker's ones. If you see the Becker's with the object of the industrial world and you compare it, of course, in a very different way, but if you compare it to Simone Nieweg's photos of the orchards, the vegetable gardens, you can detect the very same intention of cataloging, like very detached in Nieweg's photos, but with a very different subject. Or Axel Hutte, we will talk about him. It is useful to introduce the third category, that is the category of the sublime, the contemporary sublime, because Axel Hutte, another German, is investigating a lot apparently unspoiled natural sites and trying to convey this sublime beauty of nature. But in this case, I put these photos also in this category because we see, say, the choice of having the idea, for example, of the forest only in its reflection on the water, and that if you take, for example, the photos one separately to the other, we can almost compare them to the Berger's one that are blurred. Like there is an abstraction, there is a very different levels of alteration. One is that the image sometimes is upside down, and another level is that although it is given by the movement of water, this effect seems to be a disturbance, a digital disturbance, so evokes a digital disturbance, a blurring in the perception of the images. So there is something that you can't really grasp, that you can't grasp in a transparent or direct way, but it is a little bit more difficult, more hidden. And so here we introduce this other category that is important because you remember how the category of sublime has been always very strong in shaping the idea of landscape, for example, in North America or also in Europe. And a lot of, say, the romantic idea of the relationship of the human with the landscape is very much relying on this idea by Edmund Burke, introduced at first by Edmund Burke in the 18th century about the sublime. What is the sublime? Sublime is something that is different from beauty, from the classical idea of beauty. The sublime is something that is linked to fear, menace, a threat, something that you can't actually control, something that you are afraid of. So, yeah, there is a fascination, so an aesthetic fascination that is stemmed from fear, from impossibility to control something too big, something too powerful. So what do we mean with contemporary sublime? The accidental nature and imperfections of these new landscapes, pervaded by disquieting subterranean currents, have entered the artistic forms of photographic expressions, occupying places formerly devoted to the representation of idyllic setting. Okay, we already more or less said this. In their altered image of an altered landscape, photographers tend to express a sense of the sublime, stimulating the kind of feeling or unease that you get when observing the power of the vastness of an object that could destroy you. Something on the edge between astonishing beauty and the sense of an imminent catastrophe. So, contemporary photographers are relying a lot on this new interpretation of the sublime, actually exactly because it helps and it allows to convey this feeling that is on the edge between something that is very messy, maybe going toward destruction and ruin and extinction at least, and something that is very beautiful, fascinating, and that is introducing new aesthetic categories that, according to which we are able to interpret what we have around. So this is why sublime has been entering again our aesthetic categories and the world of contemporary photography and representation. And I guess also we could maybe make a discourse and enlarging this to, I don't know, architectural representations or a lot of imageries of recent contemporary imageries. There is this fascination with something that is vast, with vastness, with unease given by vastness. So a different sense of the sublime caused not by nature itself, but by its destruction. Okay. So here we have to, again, Gursky, but especially we're going to talk about Mizrak. Gursky, I put it here because in the beginning of his career, before producing the images that we saw at the beginning of the lecture, he was very much inspired by, for example, by the German painter Caspar David Friedrich, that you, of course, know very well. So there are these tiny human figures. This is still a way of photography that is not altered. It's a photograph that is not then produced in the computer. And there are these tiny human figures immersed in this huge natural landscape that is echoing this idea of the sublime, typical of the aesthetical tradition of German Romanticism. And I want to focus a lot on Mizrak with the contemporary sublime, because Mizrak is the best interpreter of, in American photography, of this idea of, and it's been much criticized for this, because he has built his own very rich career on the idea that something polluted, something very bad, something very the product of disruption, exploitation by men, etc., can anyway have an aesthetic value. And he has been shooting photographs of big sizes and always in color for example, in this case, the Cancer Alley, so-called Cancer Alley, that is then been collected, all the photographs have been collected in this book that is called Petrochemical America. Cancer Alley is, I have it later, so I'm mixing a little bit the categories. Anyway, it is near Louisiana. It is part of the, it is this area of the United States of America in which the petrochemical industry has created a landscape that is very polluted, that is causing also the death of not only animal and vegetable species, but also it is called Cancer Alley because it has provoked a high degree of cancer in the people who live there. I don't know if you saw True Detective. It's a series. Anyway, it is also a television series. It is also set in the Cancer Alley, so there are these very polluted and mephitic landscapes. I guess, ok, sì, sono le 12 meno un po', siete un po' stanchi forse. You want to make a stop? You want to make a break and when we start again at 12? Okay. Alright. So, we were telling that guys, also you who are at home, I'm sorry for being late. I had some problems at the Gobi Center, but now it's solved, so we start now. We were commenting about the contemporary sublime, if you remember. We are here in one of these desert cantos by Mizrak, and especially in the one called Border Cantos, in which Mizrak photographed the wall border between the United States and Mexico along all its development, as it was. You can interpret in several times, in several ways. In a way, it's a scarping landscape, or it could be a trace, as many others in the landscape. So in a way, of course, it's tackling the political question of the border between the United States and Mexico. And so there is a political intention in this work, and una denuncia, something that is talking about the difficulty of the clandestinos passing the border, and there is also work together with the musician based on all the objects left by who tries to cross the border that are transformed into musical instruments. There is an interesting work around it, but what I want to focus on is the fact that, of course, these photos are conveying, although they are talking about something very quite terrible in political terms, they are actually showing us an amazing American landscape that still embrace this idea of the beauty of the wilderness of the American desert that is part of the ambiguity of all the desert cantos in Mizrak's work. So there is this sense of sublime that we gain from these photographs, although they are conveying a disquieting sense of something politically very, very negative. But Mizrak is telling us that there is something wrong there, but at the same time, he's looking at it with the touched eyes, catching the beauty, the involuntary beauty of the landscape. Or, for example, the same can be said of other desert cantos in which Mizrak depicts places and sites in the desert that has been the areas for nuclear tests or military bombing tests. There are many places in the desert, the American desert, that has been devoted, since they are far from the view, devoted to military exercises or nuclear tests that are completely destroying and leaving undeletable, yeah, something that can't be deleted, traces on the landscape, and that eventually also doesn't avoid the landscape of the desert to be incredibly beautiful, amazingly beautiful, because there is always this double point of view, this double gaze. Many very catastrophic scenes are, for example, caught with the sunsets on their beds, in a way to convey this double vision of a beauty, of a sublime beauty, and an apocalyptic scenario of the destruction of the desert and the environmental disruption of the landscape. Because, of course, many times, as in Cancer Alley, in Mizra's work, there is an environmental stance, something that you goes there to look for places that are environmentally threatened by men, by improper uses by men, of course. So they celebrate the beauty of the American West against the sometimes apocalyptic scenario of its modification, documenting the effects of phenomena of environmental degradation due to many causes, many things like urban sprawl, tourism, industrialization, or petrochemical processing, nuclear tests, military exercises, fires, floods, for example, fake or wrong engineering solutions for the drainage of the water. For example, now we will see the Dalton Lake that is due to one of these, in California, that is due to one of these mistakes in the design of the hydraulic infrastructure, and that have led to the submersion of the whole village desert. So there is this idea of the conflict between the civilization and nature at the root of the myth of the American West, and the modification of the evidence of this human modification. Okay, I go fast on this because we already saw it, but this idea of the supply is very present also here, of course. And again, Sonia Brass. In Forces, she's bringing at the next level, let's say, this idea of constructing models in an atelier in order to evoke natural disasters. So there is a very powerful natural force, the title is Forces, that is not taken in its real happening, in its real manifestation in nature, but is recreated on purpose in the models. And always the same way of working that I was telling before. She did then destroy the model, and only the analogic photographs is remaining. So there's always this idea of something menacing, something that is on the edge between existence and non-existence, between extinction, let's say. And this simulation. Okay, then after the sublime, another category that is an aesthetic, properly aesthetic category, that is linked to the sublime, because it has been actually always been recognized as a sort of sub part of the sublime. That is the uncanny. In Italian, it would be something unsettling, perturbante. Freud is talking a lot about the uncanny. Maybe for the Italian, it's more familiar to say perturbante. What is the uncanny? The uncanny is this class of terrifying which leads that to something long known to us, once very familiar, according to the definition given by Freud. So it is not the sublime, because it's not something that, to say, direct fear, terror with the enormity of nature, but it's something that tells us about something familiar, but it is not exactly that thing. So that is unsettling because of this, because it's familiar, but it's not at the same very time. So, for example, another scholar, Ernst Jentsch, describes it as intellectual uncertainty, something that you can't really grasp because it unsettles your given categories. Or something, as according to the more trivial definition of Wikipedia, outside one's familiar knowledge or perception. So, uncanny. Today, this is a sentence taken by a recent exhibition that has been held in Madrid that was called the Uncanny Contemporary Photographer at Parasol Unit Foundation Contemporary Art. I'm sorry, I said Madrid, it was in London in 2016, and the curator of this exhibition was Siba Dalan. And she, in the introduction to this exhibition at Parasol, she said, "Today, we live in a society that is simultaneously risk-loaded and risk-averse. So we are very used to risk, to manage, but also very, and of course, it was before COVID. So now, of course, this is quite more true than ever in this moment in which we are very good at facing risk, but at the same time, we have very, we are much threatened by risk. Let's say psychological, we don't know exactly how to deal with this emotionally. We know how to deal with risk pragmatically, maybe on a scientific base, but we are always more unsettled by the potential risk that we are going to face. So we are acutely sensitive to the uncanny, and the feeling it generates has become more than ever. Has become more than ever associated with a sense of danger and threat. However, we need to be aware that the uncanny has an important intellectual component that can be both playful and challenging, subtle and sophisticated. So there is something interesting, something stimulating in the uncanny, although it is something that scares us because it is unfamiliar, being at the same time familiar. We have a lot in literature, we have a lot in cinema, of course. It's a category of our times. So other notes that I took here. The uncanny can be seen as a domesticated version of absolute terror. So it's terror, but disguised as something familiar. As in the horror movie in which you are at home and the menace comes from your own apartment, you know? No longer associated with the elusiveness of nature, but with the subversion of meanings normally assigned to familiar and reassuring situations. Okay. So, for example, this is the most famous Gursky's photograph, and maybe his favorite. He also said that it's his favorite photos in all his work. It's called Rhine Second. It's shot in 1999. Of course, this is the Rhine, Reno. I wanted to associate with this quotation by Gursky himself, who says that reality does not exist as such, but only as a construction. What is uncanny in this photo? As I told at the beginning of the lecture, Gursky doesn't catch reality as it is, but he recreates it. So according to his conviction that he has that reality does not exist as such, it is a construction. It's what we see in reality. So this is the Rhine, but of course this is a version of the photo in which we have a construction, a very rational construction in strips, horizontal strips, in which we see the sky, a cloudy sky, the river between two strips of grassland, with no disturbance of any other element which could distract from this very straightforward vision of what reality is considered to be the same. River, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 strips, 6 horizontal strips, 2 colors, different textures, and that's it. So this is uncanny because we recognize the uncanny stays, especially in the fact that, as in many other Gursky photographs, we recognize subject, we recognize the referent, we see the river, but there's something strange in it, as in the cow at the beginning of the lecture, because of course it is not something that we could eventually see exactly like this in reality, but we would see it in a very different way. So there is a filter. The photographer is filtering the image for us. And this is unsettling us because it makes it much more familiar than it would be. The same thing happens when you manipulate completely the proportions in a way that an object in the landscape can appear with a monumentality, a monumental scale that it usually wouldn't have in the reality. So you perceive in the photograph these, say, these two different levels: level of the infrastructure, the level of this path in which this very small human figure is going through, and there is a sort of impossibility to conceal these two worlds because they are very far one from the other in terms of scale. Or this is a very typical example of uncanny. Architects has also played with uncanny sometimes. This is a much older photograph by another American photographer, Joel Sternfeld. It's the one who made the photographs of the high line before the intervention of Hilary Scofidio and Corna. When the high line was cultivated, occupied by uncultivated vegetation, is the photographer. And this photo we can see there's a little bit a very uncanny, disturbing version of the edit through photo in which we have this sort of section, this stratification, in which here something very, say, violent is happening because there has been a flood, and what you see is the appearance of the surface of the reality as everything is going very well and normal, a normal base. In this part of the photo, here we have the abyss of violence and death and whatever. In the rest of the photo, it is like exploring an obscure side of reality. Or here, also Sternfeld playing with this idea, with something that is familiar but also not. Misrach. I just show you these ones because I wanted to introduce this category of uncanny, but I don't say I want to comment 2 hours each photo. And Simone Nivek as well, yes, transmits this idea of the uncanny in having this in portraying these cabbages and vegetables with a very lenticular view, as in a veduta of the 800s, like as Canaletto does with the canals of Venice, with a very lenticular and super detailed vision of each piece of these cabbages that are a little bit also evoking the feeling of a natura morta, no? Si dice natura morta in inglese. That nature. You can translate it like that in English. Natura, no. Anyway, yeah, maybe yes. It's my ignorance. I don't know actually, but anyway, natura morta. You have to grasp the concept. Also here, this. Okay. Then another level of this uncanny and of this alteration, as I told you, is when Wolfgang Tillmans, the same one as the filtered colors views of the city from the top, from the aerial view, is actually merging 2 different techniques. A technique made of a photograph of the reality, so taken from a subject from the world. So, for example, in this case, there is a vegetation field, like a countryside scene. Here, the horizon of the sea with mountains on the background, and then it superposes with a very normal photograph, a technique of intervention directly on the negative with lights and actions that is not the first one doing this, but is creating very interesting images, merging together these 2 things. They're taken from reality and then a post-production directly on the negative in order to create these filaments or other things that superpose to reality and makes it unrecognizable or anyway creates an augmented reality, something that is more about digital world or manipulation of the image. Or super uncanny for me, and then we will see better in which sense. The investigation by Richard Misrach about what he calls the mysterious opacity of other beings. For example, for many, he made two different works. One is called On the Beach, another one is called The Mysterious Opacity of Other Beings, in which he takes from the top views of people bathing or laying in the beaches, for example, and convey this idea of many things. So you can read this image on many, many levels. You can see that the metaphor of living on Earth, let's say, being so small in a very big thing, or you can see it as a metaphor of, or maybe something on the edge between having fun and being dead. Say, you don't actually know if it talks about, I don't know, people who are just having a bath in the water, or you mix it. We are forced to mix it with images of the migrants, or many terrible images of migrants that we have seen in the past few years, unfortunately. And so we are there, and we are asking ourselves, what are they doing? Are they alive? Are they sick? Or are they corpses just wandering around? And so, yeah, okay. This other category is the one of Paradise Lost. And of course, you can see that all these categories are linked one to the other. So I invented some categories that are useful just to group the photos in a way, but they are quite, you can exchange them, you can superpose them wherever you want, however you like. Anyway, the Paradise Lost group a series of photographs that are devoted to try to look, to search with a sort of nostalgic gaze the unspoiled nature in our planet. So, in the face of continual violations of everything that might produce or foster a sense of belonging, the myth of remote places, not yet touched by this devastation, grew. And it is places like this that Thomas Truth, for example, explores in the Paradise series, in which he photographs forests in different parts of the world, offering sublime visions of a nature before the fall of man. For example, these photos are shots from this series, the Paradise series by Thomas Truth, in which we are in different parts of the world, Australia, Brazil, and others. We can see this idea in which many photographers have dealt with this in different ways, but this is a symptom of our time. It is a symptom of, well, we were at the end of the 90s, beginning of the 2000s, but it's something that is still, there are a lot of other Castell, I think, that recently have done a series on exotic vegetation in Amazonas. I'm not sure, but anyway, there are many working with these teams because it's a symptom of what we are searching for in terms of landscape imageries. We are always fascinated, or artists. Mangrané, Philippe Mangrané is a Brazilian. There's been an exhibition recently in the Under Bigotka of his work. I remember only the surname, that is Mangrané, that also goes into, say, Amazonas, because of course Amazonas is dead almost, but trying to work within this idea of the unspoiled, what still exists in terms of unspoiled nature. Others, okay, then when you can look through that. Sonia Brass is always dealing with this thing. In the series that I showed you before, there are also pieces in which she, sometimes with models in the studio, sometimes the big just taking photographs of, for example, sometimes in some zoos, or sometimes in this is it, I guess it is a photo of the photo. So she's playing always with the fake and real, but introducing this idea of the wilderness. Or here, For example, here there is an explanation, a better explanation, which, for example, she, in this series you are here, she photographed made-up natural scenes. For example, she takes pictures in zoos or museums of natural history, and she puts them alongside ones of actual landscapes. So this juxtaposition could be seen as a metaphor for imaging the media, where the viewer finds it hard to distinguish the true nature from false nature. So what is a landscape made up for tourists, for making us think that nature is still there waiting for us, or playing with this idea. For Axel Hut, as we already saw, that has made journeys in the remotest places of the world in order to bring these forest views into out of the darkness. Okay, and then we go into what I meant with Cancer Alley. We're going to explain a little bit what Mizrak does with this poison landscape. So attributing to a landscape now structurally manipulated by human action an aesthetic value similar to the one its predecessors attributed to wilderness, Mizrak remains, as it were, enraptured by its spectacle. In doing so, he introduces into his vision of the world the germ of an ambiguity, the subtle and radical suspicion that there is nothing original left, that modification is the only valid category, the point from which to start to consider our idea of landscape. And so, the petrochemical America here comes at our, say, it is the best maybe example about this poison landscape and the aesthetical value that can be attributed to this poison landscape. He went there for several years, and the book was only published in 2013, together with the landscape architect Kate Orff, who did surveys and schemes of the land of the area, and an environmental based reflection on the future of this area, this completely destroyed area by the petrochemical industry. And actually, for example, in these photos, we see, for example, this is a pipeline of this petrochemical system, and you see the color of the water that actually is, these trees, this sort of scalatric presences of trees that are completely, which life has been cut off by the pollution of the environment and of the water. So you always see this kind of green color of the water, and the mix between the effects on vegetal elements and on natural elements of the presence of these, not only the infrastructure in its material presence, but the invisible effects of the industrial, the petrochemical industry. That is the pollution, the bad air, the bad water. So the fact that there has been also a extinction of many species, that people are getting sick with a very fast speed. So Cancer Alley is, I was explaining before, this corridor stretching along the course of the Mississippi River for about 240 kilometers between New Orleans and Baton Rouge. This shocking landscape in which human settlements are strung out through a marshy and rocky territory filled with the toxic waste of petrochemical industries that meet a quarter of the United States requirements. And after Mizrak investigating this area in his petrochemical America research, as I said, there have been for example, this television series I was mentioning before, other people and authors who merged in this landscape in search for this toxic atmosphere and mood. So these are all images taken from this book and this research that has been going on for some years. Actually, the Bob Allen this morning we are not so different than when I was passing with the train through the marshes there. I was thinking, very miserable. The light was kind of same. And another one that is working in a more, maybe in a more didactic, direct, and maybe less interesting in terms of artistic quality. Of course, it's my idea. On these topics is Edward Burtynsky. Maybe you saw recent exhibitions that displayed everywhere. You saw the documentary movie Anthropocene that has been issued last year, 2 years ago, maybe 2 years ago, in which is photographing mostly from the top, from an aerial view, and is always dealing with these effects of human exploitation of the planet, especially for productive reasons. In this case, he was catching in this very powerful image the oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico in 2010, June 2010, in which you see the freighter scattered over the surface of the ocean and the chemical substances that are merging slightly with the water, giving a beautiful image of this contamination, of this very terrible event that contaminated the ocean. A different category that is kind of the same, but toxic contaminated soil. But we are always in the great category of the pollution, in which again I push on this idea in which the contrast between an aesthetic aspect and an unpleasant subject matter is explored. There is a beauty, an aesthetic pleasure that you kind of feel guilty for this aesthetic pleasure because it comes out of a very unpleasant subject. The beautiful landscape as cliché is left in the background of more topical questions and anxieties. These images are capable of stirring at one and the same time feelings of attraction and repulsion, of familiarity and disquiet, broadening the horizon of the reference and redefining established aesthetic codes. And we have again Berger, because Berger began in 1986 with this photo, that is his first poison landscape picture, a very long work on lands, places, polluted, contaminated soils. He went there photographing once, and then he came back after, I don't know, 20, 30 years, sometimes when this land has been reclaimed, in order to see what happened with contaminated soils and lands. So the photos, many times these photos are portraying a before and an after in reclaimed sites that have been characterized by a specific kind of contamination, let's say. So this photo, he says, was a wake-up call because it's from there that he started intensive research in Westlake locations in order to explore in his photographic work this contrast between form and content, with this pleasant subject and pleasant appearance of the subject. Like this, for example, these photos. Okay, well, we commented already this topographic view. Anyway, you feel that there is this idea in which contaminated soils or polluted soils can be investigated in the very same way as other aesthetic, other landscapes. So there is a suspension in the judgment. There is a suspension because actually the aesthetic pleasure doesn't necessarily need to step out of something right, you know. It's a little bit like if you read already the Alain Roger's piece that I gave you for the first lecture, when he said that at the end of his piece, he said that when he talked about the greenery and the fact that the landscape shouldn't be necessarily all green, and the aesthetic beauty or the aesthetic quality, let's say, not beauty, the quality of the landscape didn't necessarily need to go together with an environmental, ecological sustainability. That doesn't mean, didn't want to say that we don't have to be careful to sustainability and to ecological issues. Of course we have, but we don't have to confuse this aspect with landscape, because landscape is also stemming from an aesthetic perception. An aesthetic perception can be tricky. That's the message. Okay, Gursky again, it's the same view as Rhine before, but this time with full of garbage, filled with garbage. Or this is a sort of Cheops pyramid, but made of garbage itself. So the matter of the soil is garbage. Again, Burtynsky, when he's investigating these lithium mines, these are the solvents of the lithium, so-called lithium triangle. It is an area that is, as usual, again, in the southern tip of the South American continent, not as usual, anyway, in America, of the South American continent, on the border between Argentina, Bolivia, and Chile, and that is responsible for the 85% of the planet's production of lithium. Lithium is the thing that you have in your cell phones. Say, without lithium, we couldn't have a technological revolution. Okay, so lithium is the necessary thing that makes us have our technological toys always updated. So this light metal that you can find in these specific regions, not only, but this is called lithium triangle because there is a great percentage of lithium in it. Actually, until the 85% lithium for the whole planet. And of course, these are landscapes that maybe we don't know, but so we maybe know that exist, but this gives them an image here. That is actually not bad, it's beautiful, but of course it's very damage. It's a great damage for the environment. For the oil fields, that are, in this case, we have this same feeling of the multiplication that we have in Gursky, but this is not digital. This is true. This is actually like that. Okay, we are almost at the end. We have other two categories and then the conclusion. No-go places. Again, Mizrak's pictures show us sublime force of the American landscape, scared by the corrugated steel barrier of the wall that, above and beyond its representation as natural element of the landscape, like the mountains on the horizon, denounces the violence of a heavily militarized frontier, where politics, nature, and culture come into tragic collision. And we are, of course, referring, in this case, again, to the border context, to the wall. Between US and Mexico that I showed you at the beginning for the sublime, this view, what was a kind of line running along the landscape, organizing the landscape as in a land art work, for example. But in this case, we see other images of this wall. Again, here, it seems again an element in the landscape. It reminds us a little bit Christophe's works of land art. Christophe and Jaco, I don't know if you have the image of the first works by Christophe, not the packaging of monuments, but the ones in the desert with these great elements, ephemeral, colored elements in the landscape. So we evoke this imagery, and then we have other images that talks about actually this the violence of this presence of the wall. So in which you see, this is a very beautiful photo with this light, this losing, but it is talking about this violence, about this division, a no-sense structure that is not ephemeral as Christophe's structures, but it is there because of political reasons. So they are very powerful if you know how to interpret them. or this one with the people on the other side that are looking, say that are populating the other side of the wall, while this part nothing is happening, and so on. Again, this is the normal dual, Cotillo in California. So different kind of scarf, human-made scarf borders, divisions, meant for different reasons that are actually characterizing a lot of our landscapes and that are part of them. These are the photos of what I was telling before, this so-called Salton Sea, that is the product of a very wrong idea of an engineering hydraulic system that was meant to bring water in a portion of the Californian desert, and that happened to be the cause of the flooding of an entire town. And then, of course, in this desert cantos, Mizrahi explored, and he made beautiful photographs of this so-called Salton Sea. It's an artificial lake, of course. It's called Salton Sea, but it's an artificial lake due to the construction of a dam, and that has been messing up a lot with in the Californian desert. Anyway, or other example of no-go places, again from Petrochemical America, places in which there is an arbitrary discontinuity. We are talking about a discontinuity in the case of the border cantos of the wall, a discontinuity that is barrier in the landscape that you can't cross for political reason, or in this case for reasons of danger. And then the last category, to be optimistic, is the apocalypse. So we finish like with a very, very optimistic point of view. In addition to the voyeurism induced by the possibility of taking advantage of an unusual and favorable perspective, which allows you to linger on the flesh pan under the sun, there is also the sense, this is a sentence by Francesco Zarot, a photographer critic, who is referring to the On the Beach work by Mizrahi, that I showed you one image. Which allows you to linger on the flesh pan under the sun. There is also the sense of uncertainty that pervades everything since September 11, 2001. And Mizrahi himself says, commenting his work, from that moment on, I no longer felt the lively atmosphere of the beach in the same way. Suddenly a doubt crept in that anyone could be in danger. A kind of grim ambiguity spread everywhere. And of course, he's talking about this, telling this, referring reference to this work. It is actually really disquieting. This is a title on the beach, a title that is taken from the title of a novel by Neville Shute, written in 1957, that was dealing with the topic of life after a nuclear holocaust. And so also this title deals with this idea of a potential menace to human life, of a potential danger. I don't say necessarily extinction, but something very, very apocalyptic. There is this troubling. There is also conveying this sense of troubling sense of isolation of human being in the world. This work, and Mizrahi also sometimes happen to compare sometimes these very tiny human figures taken from the top of the seaside with the tiny figures collapsing, say, falling down the towers where collapsed on 9/11. Or other images from on the beach in which these human beings appear to be very, very tiny, a little bit like insects in this surface of water. So there is an aestheticization of this, but also a very dark and bitter subject and the reflection behind these photos. And again, the quiet dissolution, these images of natural disasters, they seem to be a flood by Sonia Brass. And she said that the perception of nature as a controllable entity leads to an increase of human influence, to the point where control, as we were saying in the beginning, achieves the opposite, the partial or complete loss of control, that is disaster. So this ambiguity between control and loss of control, and this model with which we began. Okay, also Mizrak is many times dealing with this idea of the disaster in the desert cantos. There is this epic also tone in Mizrak's desert cantos. Here we have these fires in the desert that are creating these effects of light in the darkness that is appealing in terms of aesthetical pleasure, but of course they are talking about destruction, death, and so on. Or the so-called Bravo 2020, that is a series of the desert cantos in which he dealt with the aspects of militarization, of the territory. There are many photographers who have been dealing with the militarization of the desert, but Mizrak was, of course, one of them. We are in the second half of the 80s, and this photo, for example, is called Crater and Destroyed Convoy, and we have here this convoy destroyed, and here this hole created by the bombings that is actually colored with this very red element that seems to evoke the color of black. So, of course, it's talking about destruction brought by man into landscape. So the effects of war into the beauty of the landscape. That can be beautiful, but of course it's menacing. Or the Pit is another series of the cantos, of the desert cantos, that is portraying this strange and unreasonable, let's say. There have been the death of many animals, and there seemed to be no reason why. So there had been a great this phenomenon in which animals died and nobody understood exactly why it happened. And all the corpses of the animals were put in these holes, in this digging in the desert. And of course, Israel made these very powerful photographs of this. So, okay, I want to close. Sorry for this a little bit pessimistic closure, but I want to finish with this, because also the idea of survival and prestige is kind of present nowadays in many all around us. If you think that Broken Nature, the 22nd, no, 22nd, I guess, the Biennale di Milano, curated by Antonelli some years ago, was about extinction. Was talking about the design response to potential extinction of the human race. It's interesting how, say, a lot of phenomena also in the realm of architecture, design, landscape reflections are dealing with this idea of how we should face design. For example, there is this prepperism phenomenon in design, in which we have to deal with the potential menace to our presence in the world, in the planet. Of course, it's something that we then also. I don't want to actually to talk about this, but to talk about the imageries that can stem from this, that are very actual and very important to grasp this, that Bailly used to define the mood of our time. How did he say? The tune of our time. Okay. So the human figure, says Owen Zanot about Mizrak, reappears in the instant before its tragic sinking into the darkness of the abyss in these photos that I showed you. Or maybe not. Maybe it is miraculously emerging from the clear waters of an immense ocean, the place of origin and home to many forms of life. So again, this ambiguity. We don't know if we are sinking or we are re-emerging. We don't know, but all these images are actually talking about. Talking about our condition on and our relation to the landscape. Not only say. All this is talking about how do we have to put ourselves in terms of interpretation, gaze, etc., in front of all these, menacing forces that we are facing. And that's it for the lecture. I just put the. We have. Oh no, I left it in the copy center. We have very short text in the issue of Lotus that I showed you, very, very short. So I put this for, if they are too many, you can choose one or two, what they are very interested, much more interested in, but they're very short. The Bali one is kind of difficult. The other one are very, very short and very, very easy. So if you like, this is the only bibliography for this lecture. And I stay. So if you want to, if you have something to add, of course I'm here and I'm happy. But for today, of course, I can stop a little earlier than usual. Don't have to arrive till 2. Also, you guys from home, if you like to write or to talk. It's which one is mandatory? So I consider them to be all mandatory, but at the same time, it is not so mandatory. I don't know how to explain. You can choose which one you want to read. Of course, if you want to read them all, better. But they're talking about different aspects because. This one, you can all read the first one because it's the editorial, so it's the first text introducing the issue. Short, easy. And Jean-Christophe Bali is a little bit difficult, so if it's too hard to read, okay, maybe. My text is about the transformations of the American of the myths of the American landscape through this exhibition of the 70s new topographics that I mentioned last time, and Mizrak. And so it's more about Mizrak. And Michele Anastasi's text, Michele Anastasi is the photographer who's coming in next time, is about these two categories of the sublime and the uncanny and the different level of alteration of reality and of the images. So it's more didactic. Okay. Yeah. So that's it. You can never read all of them, but it's up to you actually, because of course it's not like it's not one of these subjects of the course that we can talk about it in the exam. But of course, I'm not asking you, all the names of the photographers. It's not. Of course, there are. I don't know. If I ask you about Gilles Clément, you have to know it. If I ask you about Bourle-Mars, you have to know it. But if I ask you about Bulski and you don't remember, don't lie, You have to grasp the concept. I need you to grasp the concept and to be useful. So, please.
Also landscape and aesthetic values that doesn't actually relate it up. You mentioned that someone was for that.
Yes. Who was the guy that we were speaking about that? But I was reading a quotation, or I just showed you photos. You mean the photographer?
In the first lecture, in the last part of the readings.
Alain Auger. Yeah. I can look for you. I can look it for you now if you want. Alain Auger. Remember the first? I take it here. I can share that on my screen. Stop sharing and I share the screen. Yeah. Okay, so bibliography of the first, we have this one, Life and Death of the Landscapes, Alain Roger from Issue Lotus. And at the end, he says a very interesting thing, in my opinion, that this, you have it also in the copy center because this scanning is very bad. You can't read it well from here, look at this. Here, okay, I thought it was more or less here. It is important. I want you to grasp this very well. Okay, maybe it's here. Okay. When he talks about the expressway, for example, the complex of the scar, the complesso della ferita, of something ruining the landscape. He says that our visions of the landscape never ceases to grow richer, to the point where such exuberance each decade now delivers its own batch of new landscapes to which art and technology make equal contributions, runs the risk of becoming a burden on our gaze and to stir up through surface nostalgia for a time in which only the bucolic countryside so beloved of some ecologists had the right to our aesthetic regard. Okay, number one, the landscapes of sound, Mary Sheffer, kinesthetic and kinesthetic landscape, potential virtual ones. This is why I lose patience with those who, in the name of conservative patrimonial, if not downright reactionary conception of the landscape, attack progress and vie with one another in complaining about the disappearance of our good old landscapes. In particular, they lament the passing of the traditional village, okay, to vanish from a landscape now only survives as a sort of relic. I shall take just one example, that of those very expressways, favorite target of the more radical ecologists who accuse them of systematically ruining the landscape. It is similar, there's something to do with it. It is this complex of the scar that I want to denounce, as it postulates a landscape in its own right, one that must be preserved at all costs. I think it is time we drop this negative vision of the expressway. Not only does it constitute in itself an authentic landscape, but like the déjà vu that Metairie produces new ones. So it is not a question of concealing the gash, of healing the wounds created by its successes with dressing of plants. We are literally taking the wrong road by thinking and acting in this way. What we need to do, on the contrary, is to transform this car into a pretty place and this wound into landscape. Okay, this is one thing. And another thing is this. When he tells the story of the guy who becomes all green, the greenola tree. Landscape and environment. This is very, very important. I want to read it. Okay, it is generally taken for granted that the landscape is part of the environment, constituting one of its aspects, one of its many guises, and that it too deserves to be conserved, to be protected, just as the environment must be safeguarded. This view, which appears to be no more than common sense, is as fallacious in its principles as it is pernicious in its effects. Strictly speaking, the landscape is not part of the environment. The latter is a recent concept of ecological origin and amenable, for this reason, to scientific treatment. We can deal with ecological issues with science. The landscape, on the other hand, is an older notion, originating in art and subject like art to aesthetic analysis. Obviously, an understanding of geosystems and ecosystems is indispensable, but it is of no help at all in determining the values of the landscape, which are social-cultural. Objective analysis of a biotope or measuring the level of pollution of a river has absolutely nothing to do with the landscape. And as the landscape, as Bernard Lassou pointed out not long ago, one can very well imagine a polluted place being a beautiful landscape, and on the contrary, an unpolluted place that is not necessarily beautiful. That is the distinction that I wanted to underline before. The fact that landscape, he explains it very well, because landscape is a social cultural value, ancient, positive on our behavior, blah, blah. While ecological quality of the land, the ecological quality of the land is something that is measurable through scientific instruments. So they deal with different instruments of interpretation. And of course, we can, we should be able to assure places that are not polluted, that are healthy, and at the same time that we value as beautiful in landscape terrace. But we can't say eventually from this that a polluted place is necessarily horrible, and that a healthy place is necessarily beautiful. Maybe there is a healthy place that is actually not beautiful at all. Why he says that it's pernicious, that it's dangerous, this attitude? Because the potential link and the superposition between environmental quality and landscape quality can bring to a misreading of landscape qualities. Because, okay, you have ecological quality, so the environment is okay, and you have places in which they tell you that they dealt with environmental stuff and that everything is okay in environmental terms. But then landscape is not a theme, has not been considered as a subject. So aesthetic quality, perception, the way we perceive this area has not been considered. Okay, if landscape architects are not the one who are measuring the level of pollution of the waters, they have to work together with the ones to do it. You know what I mean? But they have a different disciplinary background, because they have to understand why landscape is perceived in a certain way. Not only if a piece of land is or not polluted, or isn't or not healthy for survival, for your living. So the two things should go together, and that's why I'm this course I'm focusing in this part on perception, because it is a part of the work of a landscape architect to deal with this perception and aesthetical quality. So it's not only linked to shape, you know, I don't want you to think that is a formalist stance, something only linked to the shape of things. It is linked to the this very deep meaning that we gave to the word landscape. That is not only about shape; it's about our perception of what of the world around us. So it's not only visible, it's not only visual, but it's also cultural. It should be meaningful in terms of it should tell us something, tell something to what we are, our cultures. Should be local maybe, but also internet. I don't know. You know what I mean? So it has many deeper levels, not only the formal one. Please.
Yes, speaker, when you approach the landscape in a scientific way, for the recommendation, there is something like the best thing, it's an algorithm combination to successfully do it. And I could design that way, strictly design a scientific way. The result can be genetic in a way that happen here anywhere. I guess that the challenge is to address between this and that. With the, what you feel about our purpose, the interpreters of the landscape of what it is, and the proper tools of someone professionally specializing in this area happening that. I also wanted to talk about how photography and how now I feel like there is a democratization of photography, because I feel like we now saw some professionals also as cameras and tools that are available now to us. We also have a way of capturing the interesting things, landscapes. So especially the sublime category, I mean, the paradigms category is something very recorded in social networks and special places like, for example, material, knowledge, you can see the picture that one day everyone takes. And I think this, I don't know, this can be used for landscape or artistic or like even some reflective inner perspective of what they're curious about. I think this is, I mean, this can lead to something fun, networking types and social assessment. But also it can lead to actually constructing and more people realize what it's the landscape of the place they are visiting.
Yeah, the relation with the social media and so this other and massive circulation of images is quite another topic of discussion that could be the topic of many other lectures. Let's say if I was dealing with this, if I was a scholar of media, then there would be also me, as landscape architects need an ecologist, I would need a media expert in answering rightly to your question. But I think that I'm not sure that I don't know exactly if the images on social media, this fascination with the sublime, with the nature, with paradise lost, of course, are part of also that kind of circulation. Of course, you see on the Facebook pages plenty of beaches and mountains and rocks, and of course, there is a kind of search for the relation with nature that is very strong in our representation of the representation of our lives. Because there in social media the issue is the representation of our lives, the representation of each one's life. So of course we are looking for a representation in which we identify, but also that we find maybe not only because we identify them, but because we find them. We value them as something worthy. So what we value as worthy, this is something that social media can explain us a lot on some aspects, not for all the aspects, but very superficial aspects, but it's also important. It's a part of the story. I don't know how much these imageries of that I showed you today merge into that huge world of the photo that we produce. I guess that they are merging through, especially through cinema, television, because I don't know if the work of these photographers are circulating so much, but doesn't matter because they are influencing the vision of other authors, blah, blah, blah. So we have plenty. I was mentioning True Detective before. It's a television series with this very beautiful actor, I don't remember his name, Matthew McConaughey, So a lot of people saw it, and I was astonished when I saw it because there's Israel there. I can see that there is Israel there. There is, I don't know. There is this vision of this beauty of polluted toxic wastelands of petrochemical Cancer Alley, and it's very strong. So these imageries came to us, arrived in other ways. Maybe we should investigate the processes, the paths, but they arrive in a way. And so probably we are interpreters of these imageries. And, but of course, there is also the other side. The one that, for example, Margherita was tackling last time in the seminar on the countryside, which she talked about this fake idea of the Chianti countryside and the windows screen with the mountain and the sky and blah, blah. And so this sort of pre-constructed idea of the landscape as it should be, like with this green hill and the blue sky, and so this quieting phenomenon in which, if you look at countryside in the Google research thing, you come out with a lot of photos similar to this that are not actually talking about the countryside as this or giving new insights of it, but it is talking about a paradigmatic and very shaped fake Disneyland based vision of the countryside. So the both things merge in our in the huge panorama and repertoire of the not outdoor photos that are in the social media. There are photographers who work with the social media. That is interesting because they are having, using artistic practices that are parallel to photography, and so they're not working with their photography, but they are, I don't remember the name of this guy from Netherlands. Anyway, it's kind of funny because he takes the photographs from the social media and he creates images with categories taken from the social media, sometimes very ironic, sometimes very provocative, but it tells a lot about these standards, preferences, the things that you always find, always the same all over the world in the social media. It's interesting. So imageries that are consolidating, and maybe we just to make a cataloging work on the social media in order to find the order to this stuff, and this trying to do. Maybe I can find the name and tell you. Anyway, it's interesting your question. I think that in this big subterranean world of photos of every day or everyone, because everyone has of course phones to make photos, etc. There is everything. There is something coming from, and there are very different levels of visual cultures for each individual. Of course, we are architects, landscape architects, we would like to be, and so our level of visual cultures should be a little bit high in order to say I think it's important for an architect to be familiar with the visual culture of his epoch. It is art, photography, etc. Because of course it's a valid interpretation of our physical environment, not only this cultural environment. So it's an instrument for us to interpret things in the world, to design, to have our own, to project our own visions on the world of the environment. So we have to be updated. We have to have a solid visual culture that helps us to in our work. But it's a very huge question about this discrepancy between the high culture of the ones who, of these professional photographers and the huge baggage of which have very different levels in itself from all the other images that has been produced. And also there is a mid-level, because these are like the big gap, but there is a mid-level, because of course photography, sometimes I'm astonished to see how also in very high cultural circles, visual culture is kind of not updated. I don't know if you see, what example can I do? Conferences of, I don't know, scholars that are anthropologists. I take an example. if you take, I don't know, a book by Tim Ingold or whatever, a piece by an anthropologist, the images that they are using to explain their theories are so the product of a not updated visual culture that you see that there is a disciplinary gap, between who is dealing with visual culture and who is not. And so sometimes they talk about landscape in a very interesting way, but the iconographic apparatus of their work is terrible. You can't believe it. And it's like normal. So there is a discrepancy. The disciplines sometimes are not talking so much one to the other. So imagine if in the high, say, level of culture, this merging doesn't happen. This merging happens on a different level, but with many other different things. I don't know. It's about the processes of cultural diffusion. It's very difficult.
I do have no.
Okay.
Maybe that's the previous question about social media and so on. We'll see different things. So we usually perceive we have a perception of the place before we go to the place because we see like so much pictures from this particular place, and they can transmit maybe feelings that we don't feel at the same time that we go in. So it started as a question, but question maybe it's more like a observation since at the uncanny part of the position of the lecture, I think in a way it responded itself. So is it digital art alteration in a way distorted reality itself?
Is the digital
alteration
in
a way distorting the reality itself?
In the reality itself. You mean that if we are brought to distort reality because we always have a pre-image of reality itself, and if it can be a category of distortion in a way, it is interesting as well. I never thought about it, but of course. It's what Giri said a little bit, that we see so many things that we don't see anymore with fresh eyes. So, and maybe what you say about having already preconfezionata, it doesn't come in the English word. Anyway, a prefigured image of a place before knowing and projecting your own wills, your own desires, your own expectations, your own.
Sometimes they be supported as well.
Yeah, can be spoiled. No? Okay, sorry. It's about mascherina and sono sorda, quindi non sento niente.
It's disappointing and also supported.
Okay, yeah, I think so. I think that it happens a lot of times. For example, when you are a little bit, it happens that. I think that happened to any one of us when we are going into a place in which we have a lot of expectations. I don't know, this, I can make you a very personal, stupid example. When I went to Granada this summer and I was to the Alhambra, and it was a hike of my life that I was willing to go to the Alhambra and blah, blah, blah. And of course, the Alhambra is kind of massively reconstructed. So this is one level of my deception. But there is also another level of deception. Deception that is what is meant for being observed, photographed in that kind of way. Bailly, Jean-Christophe Bailly, of which I can suggest you a book. Unfortunately, it is in French and in Italian, so in English I don't know if it exists. It's called La Frase Urbana. The urban sentence. He, for example, explains the different experience that we have when we are strolling in in a city and have points to say this signs that tell you there is a monument, this stuff is important because of this, and this is a path that is constructed for tourists, for the use of tourists along the city, in which you have spots of cultural interests in which you are supposed to go and that you are supposed to enjoy. And he explains, say, the fact that this touristicization, and it's similar maybe to what you're saying, of our cities is avoiding, in a way, personal, the experience of the flaner, no? The flaner of Baudelaire flaner of the 19th century, the one who strolls and discovers, the one who discovered the city as it was always a new place, a place where things can happen, where you don't know what will be happening after, and where everything can be stunning. And so it's something, as I told, when I was to Delam, it was kind of, it was the most interesting experience of my summer. It was maybe the less interesting, because there was a path, there was a thing. I had a lot of expectations, or I had a lot of impressions already, and it's different than when you are left free to create your own experience. This seems to be very banal, but I guess that we are a lot of our experiences around the world sometimes are managed by this overproduction of images or over touristicization of the world. Because okay, you know, if you go to Taj Mahal, it's that, and everybody's. Maybe if you go in the garden on the other side of the river and you see the Taj Mahal from the back, through this filter of orange trees, you really have that moment. You know, I don't know if I answered, but it's yeah, it's an actually, of course, our pre-knowledge of the places is an alteration of our perception, of course. Imagine the painters that went in the Campagna Romana looking for Poussin, and they found the malaric marshland with pine trees instead of the big oaks with pastoral scenes. It's a distortion, but it is all art, and that's why we also have to deal with these big, with these distortions of social media, because we absorb them. It's part of the cultural construct that we have at disposal to interpret things. So our cultural construct have the high cultural, the visual culture on one side. They have also that one. They have all of these. Our cultural construct is made of all its suggestions and sollecitazioni, no? So it's made of many things, many different things, and it's always changing. Anyway, it's interesting how also it gave to you reason to think and to, yeah, it raised different questions. Okay. So it's that. It's. Do you agree with this? It's.
I actually agree, and I think that the tools that we are currently using, such as bubbles or digital, it creates for digital operations.
Yeah.
For instance, the geological cameras that are in fascinating we're more precise, since you have 500 pictures in film. And I personally think that maybe analytical pictures that were on the analytical cameras were better because they have another the perfect shot that we are trying to do this time.
Yeah, what you say comes to my mind two different things. One is that I agree on one side because, say, for example, this is a camera, but you have not so much choice. It restricts a little bit your potentiality to choose. Of course, if you know a lot how to use any instrument, you can choose. But of course, you are supposed to choose less and less, so to make less choices. So on one side, the other is that at the end of the day, actually, maybe I think that the technique is important, but you can use the technique whatever you want. You can shape the technique and you can dominate the technique. So the technique goes together with the culture. Of course, the way you see is much more important than the instruments that you got. Although they are dependent one on the other, because you see according to the instrument that you have and you use your instrument according to the way you see. So they are linked one to the other. But in my opinion, I would be more keen to recognize, to give much more responsibility to the way we see than to the technique. But it's a personal stance. Because you can shape it, you can really move through a technique. It's like when, I don't know, but of course it's important. That's one, that's
so you say what is more important than the technique?
The way the image that you have of the world and which you catch the world through your instrument is more important than the potentiality of the instrument. It's more important than what the instrument allows you to do. Although, of course, it's dependent on it because you can do a panoramic view with this, so maybe you will do a panoramic view, or else you couldn't have done it. It's normal. Technique is part of the thing, but maybe we sometimes give too much responsibility to techniques because you can do whatever you like with techniques. Let's say you're not. They are giving you, they are opening you possibilities, but they are not forcing to follow a certain path. It's you. It's your own use of them. It's like the social media, the computer, when many people are criticizing and we're not writing anymore. You young people is not able to write anymore because it's not okay, but it's not a problem about say. I'm sometimes skeptical when the responsibility is all given to a potentiality, technological potentiality, instead than on the cultural, say, vision that according to which we use these instruments. It's always been like that, because instruments are changing things, but then depends on us. There are people who have a view. I'm very, it's difficult to tell you, but I personally actually tend into that direction. And it's almost 2 o'clock, but not yet. Other things, guys? Maybe there are the people from home. I didn't see if they wrote or tell. No. Guys, everything okay? Tom, you want to ask something? I'm still recording. I can stop.